Okay, let's go on to IRS next question, question 9. Now, I did say they're going to lead us through this really slowly, which they did. They just wanted to milk those 6 pages for all it was worth, I guess. It is an individual who mines virtual currencies, a trade or business subject to self-employment tax. Now, gee, tax preparers, what do you think? Someone's got to pay that FICA, right? And if there's not an employer paying it, well, then, the individual who's engaged in the trade or business is going to. So the IRS answer was, if a taxpayer's mining of virtual currency constitutes a trade or business, and the mining activity is not undertaken by the taxpayer as an employee, the net earnings from self-employment, and then they're going to define it for us, gross income derived from carrying on a trade or business less allowable deductions, resulting from those activities constitute self-employment income and are subject to self-employment tax. Again, this is a no-brainer for tax preparers. We're going to just have these folks report their income and expenses on a Schedule C unless they're functioning as an S-Corp. And I do have a couple of S-Corp clients, and that's what they do is they're mining virtual currency. And it's just a normal S-Corp. There are a few bookkeeping issues, which I'll talk about in part 3. But other than that, this is just like any other trade or business. Don't let it scare you. Question 10. Does virtual currency received by an independent contractor for performing services constitute self-employment income? So what they're getting at here is what if I'm just an independent contractor and I'm receiving virtual currency? I'm not necessarily a miner, but I'm receiving virtual currency as income. And typically what these clients are is they're doing work for some overseas company that's high-tech, and the overseas company doesn't want to get involved in trying to exchange euros for dollars. They're just going to pay the guy in Bitcoin, and it's all, all done. So what would you think the IRS's answer would be? Of course, it is yes. And here's their actual answer. Here we go. Self-employment income includes all gross income derived by any individual from any trade or business carried on by the individual as other than an employee. Consequently, the fair market value of virtual currency received for services performed as an independent contractor measured in US dollars as of the date of receipts constitutes self-employment income and is subject to the self-employment tax. Okay, so a miner is going to be subject to self-employment tax, and someone receiving virtual currency as an independent contractor is also going to be considered self-employed. 11. Does virtual currency paid by an employer as remuneration for services constitute wages for employment tax purposes? So now the IRS has moved away from the independent contractor and the miner, and they're saying, what if you're an employee and your employer is paying you in virtual currency as wages? So, once again, this is obvious for any tax preparers. Taxes 101. Yes, generally the medium in which remuneration for services is paid is immaterial to the determination of whether it constitutes wages for employment tax purposes. And again, we all know this. The fair market value of virtual currency paid as wages is subject to federal tax withholding, FICA, FUTA, must be reported on Form W-2. So, once again, if you earn virtual currency as an employee, it's just like anything else. And so what these questions and answers are trying to address are those people who are trying to not pay tax. They want virtual currency in some magical, mystical way to be exempt from the tax laws. And what the IRS is driving home here, question after question, is no, it's income just like anything else. But, virtual currency is property. So, this is the same gig. If your employer says, I'm going to give you the 67 Chevy pickup truck instead of wages, does the value need to go in your W-2? Of course. And does the fair market value of that Chevy pickup need to have FICA withheld? Of course. So just like any other kind of property. Is payment made using virtual currency subject to information reporting? Of course. A payment made using virtual currency is subject to information reporting to the same extent as any other payment made in property. So remember I said taxation of virtual currency is just a lot like taxation of property. Exactly right. So the IRS continues. For example, a person who in the course of a trade or business makes a payment of fixed and determinable income using virtual currency with a value of $600 or more to a U.S. non-exempt recipient in a taxable year is required to report the payment to the IRS and to the payee. Now, remember, this is really just if it's in the course of a trade or business. Remember, if you pay your gardener using virtual currency to take care of your house, there's no reporting, no information reporting required. Okay, question 13. Is a person who in the course of a trade or business makes a payment using virtual currency worth $600 or more to an independent contractor for performing services required to file an information return? And you're thinking, God, didn't we just do this? Yes, you are required to file a 1099 miscellaneous, giving a copy to the person you paid, mailing the copies into the IRS to show that you paid $600 or more to that independent contractor. And once again, what we have is the IRS just saying, people, there is no escape. There is no escape. This is still income. We don't care what you call it. You can call it Bitcoin, you can call it Ether, you can call it Litecoin, you can call it Amazon coins, you can call it whatever you want, but it's still income. And even though it feels like you're being beaten over the head with this, and I certainly felt like that when I read this, this really is dealing with some of the issues that virtual currency users have. A lot of them are looking for the way out. What's that secret way out that will make this tax-free? And one of your jobs as the tax preparer is going to be convincing them that that magic way, it doesn't exist. Okay, that this is income just like anything else. Okay, are payments made using virtual currency subject to backup withholding? And of course, the answer is payments made using virtual currency are subject to backup withholding to the same extent as other payments made in property. Therefore, payers making reportable payments using virtual currency must solicit a taxpayer identification number from the payee. Remember, we're always telling our clients, get the W-9 filled out before you even start paying the person, right? We always say that. Nobody listens, but we say it. The payer must back up withhold from the payment if a TIN is not obtained prior to payment, or if the payer receives notification from the IRS that backup withholding is required. So I don't know if you've ever had this happen, but I've had clients whose independent contractors have given them wrong SSNs or EINs, and the client gets a letter from the IRS saying, this isn't a real number. And what happens then is that there's supposed to be backup withholding of 28%. So that's supposed to encourage that person to give a correct EIN or SSN. Okay. Are there IRS information reporting requirements for a person who settles payments made in virtual currency on behalf of merchants that accept virtual currency from their customers? It's kind of a confusing question. Here's the answer. Yes, if certain requirements are met. In general, a third party that contracts with a substantial number of unrelated merchants to settle payments between the merchants and their customers is a third-party settlement organization. Now, you and I know these people as credit card processing companies. That's the English for all this. So a credit card processing company is required to report payments on a Form 1099-K. Now, we've all seen these from our clients who are self-employed, 1099-Ks. For a calendar year, and they're required to send a 1099-K to the IRS and to the person who's holding that credit card account if both of these are true. One, the number of transactions settled for the merchant exceeds 200, that's just the number of transactions, 200, and the gross amount of payments made to the merchant exceeds 20 grand. Now, both of these have to be true. So if I accept payment on my credit card and it was one payment for $20,000, a 1099-K need not be filed. If I have 300 transactions settled to my credit card, but the total of those is less than 20 grand, I'm still not going to get a 1099-K. Both of these things need to be true for a 1099-K to be issued. Okay, so the IRS answer continues. When completing boxes 1, 3, and 5A-1 on Form 1099-K, transactions where payments were settled made with virtual currency are aggregated with the transactions with payments made with real currency to determine the total amount. So what is that saying? It just means that if the credit card has been used to receive dollars as well as virtual currency, it's all just added together. There isn't a separate, the IRS is explaining, there isn't a separate box on the 1099-K that says this is how many Bitcoin I got. You're just meant to convert all that Bitcoin or whatever it was that you received into dollars and put the total amount on the 1099-K. I recently saw a really terrifying 1099-K from a client, which I'm going to show you a little bit later in this class, so stay tuned. Question 16. And this, I love this one. Will taxpayers be subject to penalties for having treated a virtual currency transaction in a manner that is inconsistent with this notice prior to March 15th, 2014? So what's the IRS actually asking is, so, we issued this just this year. If you, didn't obey these rules before we issued them, are you still subject to penalties? Now just take a moment and guess. What do you think the IRS answer would be? We've waited 5 years to address this issue. We finally issued 6 pages of guidance. What happens if you didn't read our minds and do this correctly? What do you think? Well, the answer is taxpayers may be subject to penalties for failure to comply with the tax laws. Underpayments attributable to virtual currency transactions may be subject to penalties such as accuracy-related penalties under Section 6662. In addition, failure to timely or correctly report virtual currency transactions when required to do so may be subject to information reporting penalties under Section 6721 and 6722. However, penalty relief may be available to taxpayers and persons required to file an information return who are able to establish that the underpayment or failure to properly file information returns is due to reasonable cause. Now, it is yet to be established if reasonable cause is going to mean you guys at the IRS didn't tell me. No one has come up with that yet. So right now, what I'm hearing from a lot of people is virtual currency users who are panicked. They didn't report their income properly in 13 and 14 because they didn't know. They probably didn't ask. And of course, our job as Circular 230 practitioners is to recommend that they amend those tax returns to properly report their income based on IRS Notice 2014-21. Whether or not they choose to do so is entirely up to them, but of course we want to be on record as having said, this is what's wrong, this is what should be corrected. And if they say, what's the likelihood of the IRS finding me? I always say, what I say to people is, if I could predict who was going to get audited, I'd be the richest tax preparer in North America. And then they laugh, and that's the end of it. They get it.